Welcome to Transformers, the podcast about how business people and policymakers are creating a sustainable future. I'm your host, Kai Embren.
In today's program, my guest is Teresa Fogelberg, a former top diplomat at the Netherlands Ministries of Foreign Affairs. She has been an OECD Working Party Chair, private sector advisor of the UN Secretary General, and executive and co-founder of the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. She has been active in many boards, both public and private, with a focus on sustainability. Her mission is to address the global challenges of poverty, inequality, and climate with solutions, using innovative partnerships between business, governments, civil society, and consumers. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Kai. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be among the very impressive lists of people that have already been podcasted by you.
You are one of the most inspiring pioneers and coach when it comes to implementation of sustainability principles and actions in both businesses and governments, often with multi-stakeholder dialogues, as I remember, as early in the beginning of year 2000, based on my work with the Business Leaders Initiative on human rights and climate change. It was also relationship to Global Compact and carbon disclosure projects, and your work with the Global Reporting Initiative. What was the driver for you to be a change maker and entrepreneur in this field?
Well, thank you for that question, Kai. I have to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in the Netherlands as a child of migrants from Sweden and Finland. My mother was a war refugee, and as a child, I think involuntarily, she implanted in me a sense that geopolitical things can turn for the worse. I remember vividly as a kid, I was thinking, what will happen if the war starts? Where can we flee? Who will help us? And my mother also had a strong feeling of social justice and compassion with those that were less privileged than us. My father, who was from Sweden, he was a great, you could say, homo universalis. He was, he taught me intellectual curiosity, to observe and to question everything and not take things for granted. He also, being from Sweden, was very irritated by what he called the Swedish complacency, always thinking that they are the best country in the world. He is, I think, the only person I know who read the Bible, the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita from cover to cover. And he taught me about the importance of history, poetry, and we made a lot of music together. And he also took me to places. When I was 10 already, he made me visit the favelas of Mexico. And that made me question, why do I live in a nice house with a garden full of tulips when other kids, don't have a roof upon their heads? Also, growing up as an outsider, comparing, not taking things for granted, meant automatically that things are not cast in stone, that they have not always been like that, and that you can change them. You can unravel old institutions, old traditions, and transform them for the better, making them better for everyone. I became an anthropologist. So I started more from the intellectual perspective, studying social organization, learning how that however different societies can be in terms of stratification on the basis of class, gender, or ethnicity, that in the end, we are all one human family in this world, so different and yet so alike. I was especially fascinated by the role of women. And I was the first person in the Netherlands who got the opportunity to serve as a junior lecturer on gender studies at the University of Leiden. But soon after, the Foreign Ministry asked me to go to Mauritania, to a desert country in West Africa, and to work within a ministry of social development on empowerment of women in a fully female team under the leadership. And we'll talk later about, I hope, about leadership and how important it is to be inspired by leaders. This was a lady called Khadasha Mint Emir, and she was greatly inspiring to me, and in a very tough desert environment in West Africa, and how with so many obstacles and so many cultural constraints, women could indeed change their lives to the better. So while I was there working in the Sahara Desert, there was a big drought happening at that period in the mid-80s. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, State Department of the US asked me as an anthropologist to help them set up a system to predict famine. What indicators can be found in a situation when there are no statistics, there is no formal system? How can you measure things that are unmeasurable, let alone how can you predict them? And that's how I got involved with what I call later as a red thread in my career, measuring the unmeasurable. So I set up something called the Famine Early Warning System. And today, 40 or 35 years later, it is still being used as a system to predict if a famine is going to happen and what kind of measures will have to be taken in terms of food security, climate change, and things like that. After that, I started working for the Dutch ministry again. And when I came back after 10 years in Africa, the Minister of Development Cooperation then, Jan Pronk, asked me to help him set up a completely new department on women's empowerment. And I also became the chair of the OECD Working Party on Women and Development, which led then to the UN Beijing conference in '95. So I can tell a lot of stories about that period, but you ask me, how did you become a pioneer and a change maker?
Yes.
Well, I think in all of that, I learned not to give up and not to get no for an answer, and to work with special support groups that inspire you and that help you get your cause, and not to be intimidated by what we call the corridors of power, and nor by those who are skeptical and say, this is not going to work, we will not attain international agreement on this, there's too much change, there's too much difference, there's too much, the gap is too large. We could make it happen in these different fields. In Beijing, the first time that China hosted the UN conference, and they had no idea how to deal with NGOs and activist groups and all that. And also, of course, the whole climate work, because after having led the Department of Women and Development, I was for 5 years Director of Research at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I got acquainted with the interconnectedness of poverty, social development on the one hand, and the natural resources, the climate, forestry, environmental nexus on the other hand, and how they are related through research. So after 5 years of leading the research department, I was asked to become a climate director, again, without any knowledge of climate, but with a full and deep understanding of what a natural resource depletion means in developing countries, having lived in one of the harshest parts of the world in the Sahel region, which was very strongly affected by climate change and lack of water and so on.
Well, let us stay there in the field of climate change, because that could be also a question for me to relate to what's happening when we look back and also mirror the early work of climate issues and the Stockholm conference in 1972 before the Rio Summit 92. Yeah. And we have the Rio +20 and the Stockholm +40 conference when we met the last time. And then the question around the Paris Agreement and what's happening in Paris, and with the end disease action plans, and now the trends also focus on SDGs and ESG policies and actions. A lot of conferences with high ambitions and plan. Still, science reporting this year the highest level of greenhouse gases on our planet. How do you see this development? A very slow process for an ambitious leader as you are?
Yes. I think you're right. If we look back, yes, 40, maybe even 50 years have gone by since all those conferences started with a focus on climate. And yes, indeed, the greenhouse gas emissions are higher than they have ever been. And we now see lately climate factors that are even beyond our control and that can accelerate these emissions so that we even go beyond this the tipping point. And if you look at the pace of all these conferences, part of which I have been head of delegation, quite a few, and we had to go through this horrible EU coordination, on every dot and every comma in the final text. Of course, you lose confidence. But I don't think this would have been where we are now. And I'll say in a minute where we are now. All of this would not have happened if we would not have gotten all the UN member states on board, and private sector agents and NGOs and government. And at that, sometimes you need a certain pace, you need a certain time in order to get all those people and all those actors on board. But if we look where we are now, June 2021, I do think we are at a unique opportunity, at a unique window of opportunity, in the sense that never before the big geopolitical players have so openly, and thank God that the US is back on board, have so openly kind of endorsed that this is so urgent that we need to kind of double, triple, quadruple the action that is needed. So I think the time, as you said, it's taken so many years. The time is, of course, maybe the most pressing issue of all. Because of this commitment that we have of the leaders, things will go faster. But also what I think another very important factor, maybe also because of COVID, but also because of other factors dealing with increasing inequality, there is also, you could say, for the first time, instead of a divergence of instruments, you have a convergence of instruments, tool, efforts, not only in the field of technical innovation, but also at the political level, but also at the level of thematic international agreements. And we started this conversation focusing on the importance of human rights, and you yourself, Kai, you were one of the leaders who in the beginning also saw the relevance of the interconnectedness between human rights and climate, but many others didn't see that. So these were always completely different tracks. And now we see them coming together and they complement each other in such a way that it will become easier to make binding agreements, because let's forget, Paris is not a legally binding instrument. It's a political agreement. But what we see coming, because Paris has such a strong moral force, that out of Paris, out of this non-legally binding instrument, we see other instruments kind of popping up. A very interesting example is that now the courts, for instance, the courts in the Netherlands in May 21, so last month, ordered Shell to reduce, the oil company, to reduce its CO2 emission by 45% by the end of this decade, so by 2030, based on human rights law, or European human rights law, because it said that citizens should have the right to live in a safe environment, and having extreme CO2 emission caused by Shell will prevent people to live safely. So you see a human right instrument being used to push forward climate action. And I think that's the interesting situation that we live in now. So on the one hand, everybody feels that we can't go on another 40 years. So we have this time argument becoming less important, or becoming more urgent, with Glasgow coming, with Glasgow on its way. And on the other hand, we see that there are more and more legal instruments coming in to force governments, but also the private sector towards action. So in that sense, I'm optimistic.
Oh, that's great. After this 40 years and you're looking back, and I understand that you sometimes feel that why hasn't it happened more than this when you look at the result of the greenhouse gases and the different types of challenges in different parts of society. With you as a Secretary General and co-founder of GRI, can you give the listener an insight how was the work to be developed under these years under your leadership?
Yeah, well, thank you. As I explained earlier, I became a climate director, and there, for the first time in my career, I really learned about the transformative force potentially of the private sector. And I was engaged, as I said earlier, advising Kofi Annan during there was Rio +10 in '92 in Johannesburg, where we developed a public-private partnership. And I was looking for a way in which we could kind of use the power of the private sector and at the same time see how it could be held accountable. Because at that time also there was a lot of window dressing, there was a lot of initiatives, just to do kind of PR by companies. But how could we kind of, how could we help them and capture this immense force of business without losing, you could say, the rights-based perspective? And there, I think GRI came up. It was launched in Johannesburg in '92. It came out of the US, where it was more like you could say, a shareholder activist group. They bought shares with companies, and then they had access to hear what companies were doing. But a truly multi-stakeholder organization that had a global ambition, that was kicked off in Amsterdam in 2004. And I had the opportunity to bring it to the Netherlands as climate director. And then I was so fascinated that I gave up my job at the government and had myself seconded, and the rest of history. But in the US, there were some really important people, Joanne Bavaria, but also Al Gore was a strong sponsor, and he came to our first big event when we launched the first big new generation of the GRI guidelines. And other important people like Bob Massey from Boston. The importance of GRI was that it was a very simple concept. Everybody knows about financial reporting by companies. And here the idea was what they called sustainability reporting by companies with principles in combination with so-called indicators, based on and rooted in the big UN conventions on climate, biodiversity, but also on human rights and women's rights. And later, corporate governance issues were added, like board composition and anti-corruption measures, and of course, tax payments. And that's a big topic now, of course, with the G7 only very recently having agreed. And the G20 will probably follow, and it will be rooted in legislation now that large companies will have to pay an equal tax across the board. And therefore, reporting on this is extremely important.
You mentioned governance, and one of the issues that has followed all these processes has been related to governance. Do you see is it a weak system today of governance, or has it been stronger? Or why don't we discuss the governance and leadership issues, how they are related to this type of policies and actions?
You mean governance issues in companies?
Yes, it could be governance in companies, but also in the political system.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important question. I do think that over the past few years, the topic of governance has really popped up. And I have, of course, specifically looked at governance of companies. And if you look now, for instance, at the European Union, there's a whole new endeavor. Actually, because of political resistance, it has now been postponed again. But there's going to be European legislation on corporate governance in such a way that short-termism, short-term gain will have to be put aside towards long-term gain for society. And there's a lot of rethinking about what is the role of business really? Is it profit, or does it have a social or more moral role? So I think for many years the topic of governance, both in public and private sector, was kind of, it was too dangerous. It was too political. There were too many vested interests. And I think now, because of those vested interests having been put on the table, also by critical investigating journalism, etc., it has now come on the table. And I think that is one of the big one of the big results and successes of GRI, because from the beginning we have always said it's the E, it's the S, it's the E of environment, it's the S of social and human rights, and it's the G of governance, because that's how, through the processes of governance, it is how power relations are being formed, how decisions are being made that have impact on all of our lives. So I think, I think in many countries, people are also rethinking democracy and in the formal political process, and telling themselves that what we took for granted, democracy through the traditional parliamentary system, is something that has stayed forever and will stay forever, and will serve the public good. Well, it doesn't. So I think there's a whole new wave of rethinking governance. And at GRI, we became specialists in our own governments in a way. And now you see many, many, many other initiatives. But way back around 2000, the whole idea of setting up something that on the one hand is very flexible in terms of, new initiatives, new content, but at the same time, having a rather formal procedure of who is part, which stakeholders are part of this process, and how do we make global decisions in the interest of the global good. We made a lot of rules, and they still stick till today. So if you look at the governments of GRI, you see that there is a very strict division of geographies, which all parts of the world should be part of this. How many representatives of labor, how many from civil society, how many from governments, how many from business, and how can we avoid that all of these stakeholders do not only fight for their own interest, but kind of beyond for the global interest. And that is something, that's a new form of governance.
But you have been going through all these governance structures as a woman, and mostly governance has been related to a lot of men sitting in positions to drive change. But how has it been to be a woman to lead this type of multi-stakeholder model as global reporting initiative?
Well, if you ask this question, I think you could ask to me personally, but of course there are many other women in the organization. But I think it has. I think it could even have been an advantage, because I have been used to work with so many different constituencies, and I had quite an experience to work with very senior, very difficult men, if I may say so a little bit bluntly. So I knew how to handle them. I knew how to handle people, very high up in the UN and in government. And so I think for me, it has always worked quite positively. And I have always worked with a lot of women around me. And on all the boards that I have worked, I've really tried to recruit women whenever we had a position and I was on a search committee, because it is still a struggle. And you as women always have to do the little extra to prove themselves. So one of my tradition is to recruit women, to coach young women, and to support them whenever they find themselves in a position that they are thinking about starting a family and they have their career. That is still a big issue in organizations. So there I always have coached them a lot, so to say.
How do you see the GRI's initiative in the future? Which is the role to come?
Well, if we look at where GRI has come, having been adopted and used by around more or less 10,000 companies in over 100 countries. So you could say a GRI could sit back and say, well, this is now de facto standard. That would be a dangerous thing. I think there are a few things for the future that an organization like GRI and other similar sustainability-related multi-stakeholder organizations should think of. And that is, first of all, maybe looking back and writing its history. I think no one has ever written the history of GRI, and at a certain moment that knowledge will get lost. So maybe that's a strange thing to say because that's about the past. I think also on the leadership issue, this topic of sustainability reporting has become so attractive and so commercially interesting for a lot of companies that there is a certain risk that what I call the accountants might take over. And because there is so much commercial interest now as well. And I think the value was also in the rights-based organization. So I think that balance needs to be very, very carefully kept, including those representatives from developing countries that don't have the resources. Otherwise, we risk to fall in the trap of becoming too American or too European, which has happened in the past. And another thing is that today, because sustainability reporting or ESG reporting or whatever you would call it, value reporting, has become so accepted and is now becoming part, even more than a few years ago, of legal requirements, a bottom-up organization like GRI will be swallowed by the big companies and the big new standard setter. And that is happening now. So there is a lot of power play out there. And therefore, I think, the movement has to stay very vigilant and not be attracted by, big players that kind of, would buy us off. And I think that's a real risk. And in order to steer that process really well, you need strong leaders, independent leaders. And there at the moment, I think the leadership could be strengthened.
What is a characteristic to be a successful leader in this type of multi-stakeholder?
We need people that work together that in the past have been enemies and that have had completely competitive or contradictory interests. So we have seen organizations like Greenpeace and Shell in the same room that, they are always fighting each other. And now we have to look for common ground. So on the one hand, you need this kind of very diplomatic skills. We are now looking at certain tensions around the Arctic Council again. You bring people together and you find a common denominator, which is, climate goals, science, which are kind of neutral factors. So you have to bring these contradictory interests around the table, which is a loose interactive process. And at the same time, you need rather strict rules. Like, if you are part of this process, this is the rules, this is what you can get out of it, this is what it's in it for you, because a lot of these NGOs, they feel a little bit exploited. They come and sit at the table, they give their name, like, WWF, Oxfam, etc. And then they are asked to leave, and, whatever is created may be public global good, but still, what is it really in it for them? So you really have to make very, very clear rules of, how does their voice count, and is the content, do they have a real say over the content? And I think it has been this kind of mix that has been successful, and you need strong people to lead this and who understand different cultures as well, because an American way of negotiating is a completely different one than if you would be from China or India or Zimbabwe or something. What is also important, I think, is more general rules of leadership. And I remember a list of 10 kind of characteristics of leadership. Always keep studying, keep reading, keep that kind of curiosity when you are in the leadership position. And when you make a decision, always look at the impact that that decision can have on the weakest member of the group, or the ones that is the most disadvantaged. Always solicit people who think differently from you and who think against you, to sharpen your own judgment. Don't cherish your own power. Try to be blind for praise, because then you will become weak. And accept ideological differences, but don't make them bigger than they really are. I would like to say, and of course, always choose democratic processes. And this is a difficult one, because when you're sitting together with a small group, you say, well, we know what the answer is. We have found the solutions. We are the expert. Why should we now go for a half a year through a public comment period where the whole world will say that we are wrong and come up with all kinds of... No, you have to go through the democratic process. Otherwise, you will not get the legitimacy. And the last one is, if you are completely lost and you say, what on earth are we doing and we're never going to get there, read a poem and read it out to the others, because then you reground with yourself and you reground with the others and you reconnect with the others and with the final aim that you were fighting for in the first place.
So can you give any good names of people that you have been inspired by in your work?
In my work, I mentioned Khadija Mint Emir in Mauritania, who lived in a very difficult cultural and climatic environment, where feminism was not something that was accepted by the government, and she was amazing, and she really taught me what to do, on the ground. And another boss that I had and that I'm still working with is Jan Pronk, who for 16 years was minister in the Netherlands government on development cooperation and later environment and climate change. And together we worked during the COP presidency of the Netherlands, and we still sit on boards together. And he's an amazing person. At 82, he's still writing books and he's still being a big influencer. So those are two people that I have worked with in my career and that were bosses and that were very inspiring. My career is that I sometimes stuck with bosses that were incompetent or that were not inspiring, and I lost energy and I lost time. So I would say choose a boss that inspires you.
Well, experience you earn through your work in your daily life, and sometimes you also have time to read a book.
Yeah.
And is it any book you would like to recommend?
I read a lot, and if there's one author that I come back to time and again, is Turgenev, one of the big Russian authors of the 19th century. And I think many people know Fathers and Sons. I think I must have reread it 6, 7, 8 times. And it's about the big questions of life. It's about compassion, love, but also the tragedy of life and of big ambitions and ideologies that gets lost, and misunderstanding also, but also love between generations.
Well, let's say that this inspiring advice for the young generation and for others who would like to go into different types of stories, let that be some of the last advice in this talk show. And I was very pleased to have you here, Teresa. And it has been very skillful for us to go through this, I think, for others also. And to give some sort of step of how we can transform knowledge and experience from one generation to the next generation. And thank you very much, Teresa, for your participation in today's talk.
Thank you very much, Kai. It has been a great pleasure.
I'm Kai Embren. Follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. where I will be announcing the future guests to this podcast. And you can expect about 2 programs a month. And each guest has a unique story of making business and society sustainable. So find out more. Visit my homepage, kaiembren.org. Thank you for listening.